She came to tell him they were having twins. She left carrying nothing but the ultrasound photos and a silence that would outlast everything they had built together. If you've ever loved someone who let you walk away without knowing what you were carrying, this story is for you. Watch until the end. And drop a like, then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ultrasound photos were folded twice and tucked inside the zippered pocket of Evelyn Carter's purse, pressed flat against the lining as if she were smuggling something that could be taken from her, which, she now understood, was exactly what they were. She'd had them for 3 days. 3 days of carrying them to work and back, pulling them out at the kitchen table each morning while the coffee brewed, tracing the faint gray shapes with one fingertip. 2 heartbeats, 2 impossible, stubborn, already real heartbeats. The doctor had said they were strong, had smiled at her in a way that doctors only smile when they're genuinely relieved. Evelyn had sat on the edge of the examination table with a paper gown crinkling beneath her and thought, tonight. I tell him tonight. She'd planned it carefully. Not because Damon Volkov was the kind of man who needed careful handling, or rather, not only because of that. She planned it because she wanted it to be right. She wanted to see his face when he understood. The real face, not the one he showed the world, not the hard jaw and the controlled stillness he wore like armor. The face beneath all of that, the one she had spent 3 years learning how to reach. Damon had texted her at 2 in the afternoon. Anniversary dinner, my office, 7 o'clock, don't be late. No softness in the phrasing, but she knew him well enough to read what lived underneath it. He was trying, in the clumsy, armored way he had always tried. She'd stood in their bedroom holding her phone and felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been there for months, winding tighter through every late night and canceled dinner and conversation that stopped before it started. Maybe they were going to be all right. Maybe the timing was not disaster, but the opposite of it. She dressed in the wine-colored dress he'd bought her for her birthday the previous year and never seen her wear, touched her collarbone in the mirror, looked at herself the way a woman looks when she's about to change her own life and knows it. The drive to Volkov Tower took 22 minutes. She counted them. The building rose against the November sky like a blade, 43 stories of glass and steel that Damon had built on ground where other men's empires had already collapsed. The lobby guard knew her face and waved her through without a word. The elevator was empty. She pressed the button for the top floor and watched the numbers climb and breathed carefully, practicing the words one more time without moving her lips. We're going to be parents. That was it. That was all she needed. The rest would come. The elevator opened directly into the outer office. Dark, both assistants gone for the evening, the only light coming from the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The penthouse office suite was separated from the outer room by a set of double doors that Damon kept closed during meetings and open when he was alone. They were cracked open tonight, 3 or 4 inches, and warm amber light spilled through the gap. She heard voices before she reached them. She stopped. Not because she was afraid, because something in her body understood before her mind did. Some animal part of her that had been paying attention all along while the rest of her was planning anniversary speeches and folding ultrasound photos. The voice was Victoria's. Victoria Hale, who had been Evelyn's closest friend for 7 years before she was anything else. Victoria, who laughed too loud and ordered the most expensive thing on every menu and had held Evelyn's hand through her mother's funeral and her father's stroke and every small catastrophe in between. Victoria, whose number was in Evelyn's phone under a little green heart because some habits from college never died. Her voice was low and precise and nothing like the way she talked when Evelyn was in the room. She's going to become a problem, Victoria said. You know that. You've known it for a while. Evelyn did not move. She's my wife. Damon's voice. Flat, not dismissive, something else. The voice of a man running out of arguments. She's soft, Victoria said. That's not an insult, it's a liability. Your world is not built for soft things, Damon. You know what happens to the people around you who can't harden. I've watched it happen. I've watched you watch it happen. A pause. Then something that made Evelyn's legs go wrong beneath her. The sound of movement, fabric against fabric, proximity. She doesn't belong in this, Victoria continued. Her voice had dropped further. Private now. Intimate in a way that made the word intimate feel like a wound. She never did. And the longer she stays, the more exposed you are. The more exposed everything is. Silence for 3 seconds, then 4. The world you built doesn't have a place for the life she wants, Victoria said. You know it. I know it. The only person still pretending otherwise is her. Evelyn's hand had gone to the zipper of her purse without her instructing it to. Her fingers found the folded edge of the ultrasound photos. She pressed them flat against the fabric without pulling them free. She did not push the door open. She did not call out. She stood in the dark outer office with the city glittering 43 stories below and understood, with a certainty that settled in her bones like cold, that she was not going to say the words she had practiced. Not tonight. Not to a man who was standing in the dark with her best friend and not pushing back. She did not make a sound. She turned and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood very still while the doors opened and closed and the numbers descended. In the lobby, the guard looked up and started to say something. She shook her head, not trusting her voice, and walked through the glass doors and out into the November air, which hit her face like a physical thing. She stopped on the sidewalk. Taxicabs slid past. A couple walked by arguing about something trivial. Somewhere above her, Damon was still in that room. She put her hand flat against her stomach. 2 heartbeats. Strong ones. She walked to her car. Ita. She did not cry until she reached the parking garage on the 3rd level, and even then, it was not the kind of crying she expected. It was quiet. It came out of her sideways, through her hands, which shook so badly she couldn't get the key fob to work for almost 2 full minutes. She sat in the driver's seat with her forehead pressed against the wheel and breathed through it, counted. The way she used to count during panic attacks in college when her nervous system went haywire and she needed something to hold. 1, 2, 3. She was 31 years old. She was 14 weeks pregnant with twins. She was sitting in a parking garage while her marriage ended without a single word being spoken. The ultrasound photos were still in her purse. She didn't look at them. She drove home in a way she could not later reconstruct, could not have described the route or the lights or how many times she stopped. She moved through it on some automatic frequency her body had engaged without her permission. And when she arrived at the penthouse they shared, she sat in the car in the underground garage for 7 minutes before she went inside. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. His jacket on the back of the chair because he never used the closet hook, no matter how many times she'd put a hook there. Her books stacked on the left side of the coffee table, his files stacked on the right, the invisible boundary they'd drawn without discussing it. Everything in its place, everything still wearing the shape of their life together. She walked through the apartment once without turning on the lights. Then she sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and searched for coastal towns in Maine. She gave herself 2 hours. 2 hours before the part of her that still wanted to stay, that was still reading signals and finding hope in a text message that said, "Don't be late." Before that part got too loud, and she made a decision she couldn't take back for the wrong reasons. She used the 2 hours well. She had money of her own. Not from Damon. She'd never touched his money. Had kept her own accounts and her own clients and her own design firm with 18 employees who sent her emails at midnight about tile samples and load-bearing walls. She had money and a profession and a name that was hers before she was ever his wife. She called her accountant at 11 o'clock at night and left a message asking him to call her first thing in the morning. She opened a new browser window and researched property rentals in 3 towns along the Maine coast. She found a property manager with reviews that mentioned the word discreet and sent an inquiry. Then she went to the bedroom and began pulling things from the closet. She didn't take everything, only what she needed, only what was hers before the marriage. She was not running. She needed to understand that herself, needed to say it quietly in the dark, while she folded clothes into a suitcase. She was not running. She was choosing. There was a difference, even if both things looked identical from the outside. The divorce papers she printed at 2 in the morning from templates she'd found online, something she'd look back on later as both the smartest and the most shattered thing she'd ever done. She filled out what she could, left the rest blank, signed her name at the bottom of the signature page with a pen that was almost out of ink. She left the papers on the kitchen table. She set her wedding ring on top of them. The ring she'd worn for 3 years. The ring she'd pressed to her lips during bad days because it reminded her of good ones. She put the ultrasound photos back in her purse. She was not leaving because she had stopped loving him. That was the part that hollowed her out. She walked out of that apartment still loving him, still carrying 2 pieces of him inside her body, and the knowledge of that sat in her chest like a stone that wouldn't dissolve. She left because she finally understood something she should have known years earlier. Love was not armor. Love did not automatically become protection. A man could love you and still fail to protect you from his own blindness, his own pride, his own willingness to stand in a dark room and say nothing while someone else rewrote the story of your marriage. She had listened at that door and heard the verdict. She accepted it. She walked out at 2:47 in the morning, suitcase in one hand and the strap of her purse over her other shoulder, and she did not look back at the apartment. Set. Damon came home at 11:15. He'd stayed later than he intended. Victoria had left an hour earlier. There'd been a conversation he couldn't fully reconstruct afterward, words that hadn't landed the way he meant them, a distance he'd felt between them that he attributed to the vodka and the hour. He rode the elevator to the penthouse with the particular heaviness of a man who has planned something and watched it go sideways without being able to name the exact moment it happened. The apartment was dark. He turned on the entry light and saw the stillness of the place right away. Not the stillness of someone asleep, a different quality. The stillness of something absent. He found the divorce papers at 3:12 in the morning. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time without picking them up. The ring sat on top. He recognized it by the way it caught the light. He had chosen it himself, had spent an afternoon with a jeweler who'd shown him 40 options, and Damon had pointed at this one immediately, instinctively, the way he made every decision that mattered, without deliberation, from somewhere below conscious thought. He picked up the ring, set it down, picked up the papers, read the first page, then the second. He moved through them the way he moved through financial documents, systematically, looking for the information that told him what had actually happened, looking for the clause that explained it. But the papers were incomplete, unsigned in the places that required both signatures, thin and generic, in a way that told him she'd printed them from the internet in a hurry. This was not a premeditated departure. This was something she'd decided in the last few hours. He called her phone. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, recorded and calm, telling him to leave a message. He did not leave a message. He called again at 3:20, 3:30, 3:41. Each time the same 5 rings, the same recorded voice. He put the phone face down on the table next to the papers and stared at the ring for a very long time. His first instinct, and he recognized it as instinct, recognized it as wrong, and felt it anyway, was fury. The specific fury of a controlled man who has just discovered that the one thing he could not control has already moved beyond his reach. He had built systems for every contingency. He had contingencies for his contingencies. He had a 7-person security team and a legal department on permanent retainer, and enough leverage over enough people that problems in his world generally resolved themselves before they became emergencies. Evelyn had walked out of a $20 million apartment with a suitcase and a decision he didn't see coming, and not one of those systems had registered a single warning. He sat down at the kitchen table. Across the city, 23 stories below in a different building, Victoria Hale stood at her floor-to-ceiling window with her phone face up in her palm, watching the screen, waiting for a particular message to arrive. When it did, 3 words, no punctuation, she set the phone down and allowed herself one small, private smile before she turned off the light. Marcus Reye had worked for Damon Volkov for 11 years, which meant he had seen things that most people's nervous systems would not survive intact. He was 44 years old, built like something architectural, and possessed of a quality that Damon had hired him for and that the organization had repeatedly underestimated. He paid attention to everything, not the loud things, the quiet ones, the small inconsistencies, the timing that was slightly too convenient, the evidence that appeared exactly when it was needed. He learned Evelyn was gone at 6 in the morning when Damon called him. The call lasted 45 seconds. Damon did not explain. He said, "She's left. I need to know she's safe. Don't bring her back. Don't contact her. Just make sure she's safe." Marcus said, "Understood." He hung up and sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, thinking. Then he called a woman in records who owed him a favor and asked her to pull the penthouse security logs for the previous evening. Entry and exit timestamps, elevator access, the full picture. When the logs arrived 2 hours later, Marcus read through them 3 times. Something about the timestamps was wrong. Victoria Hale had accessed the building at 5:12. Evelyn had accessed the building at 6:48. Evelyn had exited at 7:03. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, she had come up, discovered something that changed everything, and left. He looked at the timeline and felt the particular discomfort of a man who has just noticed a crack that shouldn't exist in something that was supposed to be solid. He did not know yet what the crack meant. He did not know what it led to, but he noted it with the same care he'd given to every other small, quiet, wrong-feeling thing across 11 years of paying attention. He wrote it down. He kept his mouth shut. And 300 miles north, in a rental car pointed toward the Maine coast, Evelyn Carter drove through the first pale light of a November morning with her hands steady on the wheel and her jaw set, and 2 heartbeats, small and strong and completely unaware of what had been arranged against them before they were born. She didn't know yet. She didn't know that the conversation she'd overheard had not been accidental. She didn't know that Victoria's access code to Volkov Tower had been issued 6 months before Damon ever introduced them. She didn't know that the divorce papers she'd printed from the internet and left on a kitchen table were about to become a weapon in someone else's much larger plan. She only knew that she was still driving, that outside the window the trees were getting thicker and the towns were getting smaller, and somewhere ahead of her there was a place where no one knew her name. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach. "We're going to be okay," she said quietly to no one, or to both of them, or to herself. The road narrowed. The trees closed in on either side. The city was 100 miles behind her now, and growing smaller by the minute. Somewhere in that city, in a penthouse office that smelled like expensive leather and poor decisions, a man sat alone with a wedding ring in his hand and a version of events that had been very carefully constructed for him, and had no idea yet that everything he believed about the previous night was a lie. The crack in the story was there. Marcus had already found it. Marcus. The question was whether he'd find the rest of it before the people who built the lie finished using it. Marcus Ray did not sleep after the 6 a.m. call. He showered, dressed, made coffee he didn't drink, and sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and wrote down everything he knew about the previous night in the order he knew it. Not speculation, not theory. Facts, time-stamped, sequenced. He had been doing this for 11 years, reducing complicated situations to their raw sequence of events, stripping out everything that wasn't verifiable, because in Damon Volkov's world, the distance between what was true and what someone wanted you to believe was true was where people got hurt. The pad filled up fast. Victoria Hale. Building access at 5:12 p.m., cleared by the penthouse elevator code, which was restricted to 6 people. Evelyn was not among the 6. She used her own separate access. Damon. Marcus himself. 3 others with specific operational clearances. Victoria had been added to that list 8 months ago, which was standard. She was a trusted associate. The clearance made sense on its face. But Marcus pulled the original authorization request and stared at it for a long time. The request had been filed by someone in the internal admin structure, not by Damon directly. Routed through a layer of paperwork that, if you weren't looking for it, looked completely routine. Marcus had signed off on it himself without flagging it, which was either an oversight or a very well-constructed piece of bureaucratic camouflage. He circled the name of the admin who filed the request, wrote it on the pad, set the pen down and looked at the ceiling. Then he picked up a different phone, not his work phone, not the encrypted line he used for operational communication, and called a woman named Sable who did contract research and asked no questions about why she was being asked. "I need a full background on someone," he said, "the kind you don't find in the licensed databases." Timeline? 48 hours. A pause. "It'll cost." "I know, do it." He gave her the name. He hung up and went to work. Betkeb. Damon did not call Victoria until 10 in the morning. He had spent the hours between 3 and 10 sitting in different rooms of the empty penthouse, moving without destination, the way a person moves when their body needs to do something and their mind has stopped giving useful directions. He sat at his desk. He stood at the window. He went to the kitchen, looked at the coffee machine, and walked back out. He lay down on the bed, her side, he noticed, without meaning to, and stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes without blinking very much. At 9:50, he picked up his phone and scrolled past Evelyn's name without stopping and found Victoria's. She answered on the second ring. "Damon!" Her voice was measured, careful in a way he'd never noticed before, or maybe had noticed and hadn't had a reason to question. "She's gone," he said. "I know, I saw the news. I heard." A beat too long. "I'm sorry. Are you all right?" "No." He didn't dress it up. "I'm not." "Come over. Let me make you coffee. Let's just... Tell me something first." He hadn't planned to say it this way. It came out of him sideways, the way things come out when a man is sleep-deprived and stripped down past his usual architecture of control. "Last night, what you said about her, that she was a liability. Damon, I want you to tell me if you meant it." A pause that was 2 seconds too long. "I meant that I was worried about you. That's all I ever..." Did she know? He heard his own voice change as he said it, heard something in it that he hadn't let out in years, something jagged. "Did Evelyn know you were going to be there?" "Of course not. Smooth, immediate." "She wasn't supposed to come until 7:30, you'd said..." "I said 7 o'clock. Silence. "I sent her a text that said 7, Damon said. "You were there at 5:12. Another pause. Shorter this time. Better controlled. "I came early to set up. I wanted to do something for your anniversary, I thought. I don't need you to set things up for my anniversary. I know that. I know. I just wanted to help. I thought..." "Victoria." His voice went flat. "Stop." She stopped. He listened to her breathe for a moment, and in the breathing he heard something he couldn't name yet. Something compressed, something held back. He filed it away without being able to articulate what it meant and said, "I'll call you later." He hung up before she responded. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after that, turning it over, looking at the dark screen. Then he put it face down on the table next to the ring he still hadn't moved. The coastal town of Ardmore, Maine had 940 permanent residents, a harbor that smelled like diesel and brine, a post office that closed at noon on Fridays, and a property management office above the hardware store that was run by a woman named Dale Fitch, who had short gray hair and a handshake like a dock worker, and who had, in 30 years of managing properties along the Maine coast, learned never to ask her renters why they were there. Evelyn arrived at 11:43 in the morning and introduced herself as Evelyn Rhodes, which was her mother's maiden name, and the name she'd decided on somewhere around the New Hampshire border. Dale looked at her. Really looked. The kind of look that takes in more than just the surface. And then handed her the key to a 2-bedroom cottage on Inlet Road without asking for anything beyond the first month's rent and a copy of an ID that she didn't study too closely. "Heat's electric," Dale said. "There's wood stacked on the back porch if you want the fireplace. Grocery store is on Pine, closed Sundays. If you need anything, my number's on the fridge." Evelyn said, "Thank you." Dale said, "Yep," and went back to her desk. The cottage was small and cold when Evelyn unlocked it. Bare floors, furniture that someone had chosen for durability rather than comfort, a kitchen with one of every appliance, and a window above the sink that looked out over a stand of pine trees. She set her suitcase just inside the door and stood in the middle of the main room and breathed. No marble, no floor-to-ceiling windows, no jacket on the back of the wrong chair. She went to the kitchen window and looked at the pines for a long time. Then she sat on the floor, the actual floor, back against the couch, knees drawn up, and put both hands flat on her stomach and stayed there until the shaking stopped. It took a while. Victoria Hale made 3 phone calls in the 40 minutes after Damon hung up on her. The first was to a number saved in her phone under a name that bore no relationship to the person who answered. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She spoke in a low, even voice, and what she said, stripped of the careful language she used to say it, was that there had been a complication, that Damon was asking questions, and that the timeline needed to accelerate. The second call was to her lawyer, which was smart and strategic and exactly what a person does when they know the ground is starting to shift under their feet. The third was to a woman named Cressida Vaughn, who worked in the organization's financial compliance division and who had been, until recently, completely loyal to Damon Volkov. The third call lasted 11 minutes. Afterward, Victoria stood at her window for a long time, looking at the city, thinking about angles. She was good at angles, had been since she was 17, and learned that the direct path from where she was to where she wanted to be was rarely the most efficient one. You found the angle, you found the leverage point, you applied pressure where the structure was already weakest, and the thing came down without you ever having to lift anything heavy. Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Volkov technically, until the papers were finalized, had been the leverage point. Soft, trusting, genuinely loving in a way that made her easy to predict and easy to use. Victoria did not hate Evelyn. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, even in private. This was not about hatred. This was about architecture, about what a structure needed to survive. Damon's structure needed someone who understood it. Evelyn never had. What Victoria had not anticipated was the questions about the timestamp. That was a problem. Damon's mind worked in straight lines, forward, aggressive, relentless. And when something crossed his straight line, he didn't go around it. He stopped and stared at it until he understood it. She had a narrow window to fill the gap with something credible before the straight line led him somewhere she couldn't control. She picked up her phone and made a fourth call. "I need the additional documentation ready," she said. "The financial records, everything we discussed." "That'll take today." Her voice didn't change. "It needs to be today." Yet, the documentation arrived at Damon's office by courier at 2 in the afternoon, a sealed envelope, no return address. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note that said only you should know what she was planning. He stared at the note for a full minute before he opened his laptop and plugged in the drive. What he found, what had been constructed for him to find, was a folder containing 16 files. Bank statements, email threads, a lease agreement for an apartment in Portland, Oregon, signed 6 months ago, a conversation between Evelyn and someone named R. Callahan discussing the terms of a separation, the protection of assets, the timeline for moving. The emails were dated over a period of 4 months. The language was practical and cold in a way that did not sound like Evelyn, but grief does things to a person's credibility as a reader. When you're in it, everything confirms the story you're already afraid is true. Damon read every file. He sat very still while he read them. The Evelyn in these documents had been planning to leave him for months, had been identifying assets, consulting with someone about financial separation, arranging a landing place. The Evelyn in these documents had not been a woman who came to the office to tell her husband they were having children. She had been a woman executing a plan she'd kept completely hidden. He closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and looked at her name for a long time. He did not call. Instead, he sat in his office, in the dark, and let the documents do what they'd been designed to do, which was transform grief into something harder and less complicated. Grief is dangerous because it leaves you open. Betrayal is safer. Betrayal gives you something to push against. By 6 o'clock, Damon Volkov had pushed against it until it became the shape of the truth. He was wrong. He would not know that yet for a long time. But Marcus found the first real crack at 3:17 in the afternoon. He'd been running parallel tracks all day. The security logs on one side, the admin authorization on the other, and in the middle, a growing collection of small things that didn't fit. The building's internal communications log showed a gap of 31 minutes in the elevator activity record between 5:12 and 5:43, a gap that shouldn't exist. The system logged every call automatically. The gaps only appeared when records were manually deleted. He called the building's IT security lead, a careful man named Ose, who answered his personal phone on the first ring and said nothing for a moment when Marcus explained what he was looking at. "That's not a system error," Ose said. "I know it's not a system error. Someone with admin-level access, I know." Marcus kept his voice even. "I need to know who had admin-level access to that log system in the last 30 days. Ose pulled the records, read them off. 3 names. The second name on the list was the same admin who had filed Victoria Hill's building access authorization 8 months ago. Marcus wrote it down on the pad for the second time. He circled it twice. He sat back and stared at it and thought about the structure of what he was looking at. A planted access authorization, deleted elevator records. A perfectly timed appearance at the office. The arrival of an envelope at Damon's office, 2 hours after Damon had pushed back on Victoria's timeline explanation. This was not impulsive. This was not a woman who had opportunistically stepped into a failing marriage. This was designed. This was engineered with the kind of precision that required resources and planning and coordination that went well beyond one person acting alone. The question was who? Marcus was already afraid he knew the answer. He called Sable. "You're 48 hours," he said. "I need it in 20. "That's going to cost more." "I know. Do it." Evelyn cooked soup from a can because she hadn't gone to the grocery store yet and didn't trust herself to drive again without a longer rest first. She ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the pines going dark in the early evening light, and made a list in her head of what she needed to do in the next week. Grocery run. Find an OB in the nearest town large enough to have one. Call her accountant back. Begin the legal process of actually separating what was hers from what was theirs. The real paperwork, with an actual lawyer, not a template printed from the internet at 2 a.m. She needed to call her partner at the firm, needed to figure out how much of the practice she could manage remotely and whether remotely was even viable for the next several months, or whether she needed to begin transitioning her client load. She needed to do 100 things. Instead, she washed the bowl and set it in the rack and went to the window and stood there. The pines moved in the wind. Beyond them, she could just make out the harbor lights. A distant scatter of yellow and white, boats she couldn't see making themselves known by what they reflected. She thought about the anniversary dinner she had planned to have. The wine-colored dress, still in her suitcase. The words she'd practiced in the mirror. She thought about the way Damon's face looked when he was asleep, unguarded in a way he never was while conscious, younger seeming, the jaw unclenched and the brow smooth. And she made herself stop thinking about it because it led nowhere that was useful to her right now. Her phone had been off since 7 a.m. She had not turned it back on. She went to bed at 9 o'clock and lay in the dark cottage in the dark, unfamiliar room and listened to the wind off the water and the creak of the house and the particular silence of a place that had never known her name. She slept. In the morning, she woke up still pregnant and still alive, which was what mattered. The Mafia Council, which called itself by a name less cinematic and more corporate, a name that appeared on legitimate letterhead and zoning applications and charitable foundation disclosures, met twice monthly in a private dining room above a restaurant that had been in the same family for 4 decades and knew better than to ask what was discussed at the long corner table. The November meeting happened 3 days after Evelyn left. There were 7 men and 2 women at the table. The eldest was 73. The youngest was 41. Between them, they controlled more legitimate capital than most small nations, routed through enough layers of clean money that their children had grown up believing their families were simply very good at real estate. Damon Volkov sat at no table. He was not technically their member. He was their most profitable operational partner, which was a different thing, a thing that came with enormous leverage and limited rights. The woman who spoke longest that evening was named Constance Adler. 68 years old, gray hair cut close, the manner of someone who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in any given room and had stopped needing to signal it. She spoke about the inheritance clause for 11 minutes, the legal provision buried in the original Volkov family charter that tied controlling authority over the family's legitimate holdings to the first biological heirs of the direct line. She laid out, calmly and without drama, what it meant that Evelyn Carter was 14 weeks pregnant with twins. She did not need to explain the rest. The other 8 people at the table already understood it. When she finished, there was a silence of approximately 30 seconds. Then a man named Fletcher, who wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries and had the eyes of someone who'd long ago decided that feeling things was inefficient, said, "The separation is already in motion." "I'm aware," Constance said. "The documentation has been delivered." "I'm aware of that too." Another silence. Then a different voice, younger, from the far end of the table. "And the woman herself? Her location?" "Not yet confirmed." Constance set down her water glass. "It will be." What no one at the table said explicitly, because none of them needed to, because this was how they had operated for decades, in the clean language of implication and strategic omission, was that Evelyn Carter and the children she was carrying represented a structural threat that had to be neutralized before birth. Not because anyone at that table was a monster. Each of them had a story they told themselves about why they were not. But they were very, very good at protecting what they had built. And Evelyn had no idea she was already on a list. Awesome. Marcus got the call from Sable at 11:47 that night. He was still at his desk, had been there since morning, the legal pad now covered on both sides. A second pad started. He answered before the first ring finished. "Tell me," he said. Sable talked for 9 minutes without stopping. She was professional and thorough, and when she was done, Marcus sat very still with the phone against his ear in a room that had gone completely quiet around him. Victoria Hale had no history before the age of 22. Not an unusual history, not a thin history, no history. The identity had been constructed, well constructed, the kind of construction that cost significant money and required inside access to multiple systems, at some point prior to her 22nd birthday. Before that, there was nothing, no school records, no family, no paper trail of any kind that led to an actual person. The name the identity was built around, Sable said. The original? It belonged to a woman who died at 19 months old in 1987, the real Victoria Hale. Whatever your person's name actually is, she took a dead child's identity and built a life on top of it. Marcus said, "Who paid for the construction?" A pause. "That's the part I can't get you in 20 hours. Keep digging." Marcus, a warning in her voice. "Whoever paid for this is not small. The system access required, the depth of the documentation. This isn't one person with resources. This is an organization." "I know," he said. He hung up. He looked at the legal pad. He thought about Evelyn Carter, alone somewhere, carrying children that two different sets of powerful people had already decided the fate of before they were born. He thought about Damon sitting in his office receiving a USB drive full of fabricated evidence and being precisely the kind of man that fabricated evidence worked perfectly on. Proud, emotionally armored, inclined to believe the worst because believing the worst was safer than being wrong about the best. He thought about the crack he'd found in the elevator logs. He thought about the dead child's identity. He thought about the 31 missing minutes. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and drove to Damon's building. It was midnight. Damon was still awake. Marcus could see the light in the office window from the street. He went up without calling ahead, because calling ahead gave a man time to construct his posture, and Marcus needed to see Damon's face when he heard what he was about to say. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Damon was at his desk with a glass of something untouched in front of him and the closed laptop to his left. He looked up when Marcus came in and didn't say anything. Marcus sat down across from him without being invited. He put the legal pad on the desk between them. "The woman has no past," he said. "Before 22, she doesn't exist. The identity was built on a dead infant's records." He let that land. The elevator logs from yesterday evening were manually deleted by someone with admin access, the same person who filed her building authorization 8 months ago. A courier delivered a sealed envelope to your office this afternoon containing documentation of Evelyn's supposed plan to leave you. He paused. "Damon, the documentation is fabricated." Damon looked at him. The glass sat untouched between them. "Evelyn didn't plan to leave you," Marcus said. "She came to the office last night to tell you something, and she overheard a conversation that wasn't an accident, and then she left because she thought—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Because you let her think she already had her answer." The silence in the room was enormous. Damon's jaw moved once, like something trying to work its way out, and then went still. "There's more," Marcus said. "I'm not done. But I need you to hear this first, and I need to know you're actually hearing it before I tell you the rest, because the rest is worse." Damon looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out and picked up the legal pad and began to read, and Marcus watched his face in the lamplight, watched the thing that moved across it as the architecture of the last 48 hours began to come apart in his hands, and thought, "There it is. There's the man under all of it. There he finally is." He gave Damon 4 minutes with the pad. Then he said, "The council knows she's pregnant." Damon looked up. His face had gone to a place Marcus had never seen it go before, past fury, past calculation, into something rawer and more dangerous than either. "How long?" Damon said. His voice was barely audible. "Long enough to plan for it." The glass went off the desk. Not thrown, just knocked, the back of Damon's hand catching it as he stood, and it hit the floor and didn't break, just rolled, the liquid spreading dark across the pale rug. He was already reaching for his phone when Marcus put a hand on his arm. "If you call her," Marcus said, "they'll know we know, and they'll move faster." Damon stopped. His hand was shaking. Marcus had worked for this man for 11 years and had never once seen his hand shake. "Then what?" Damon said. The two words came out stripped of everything. No command in them. No strategy. Just a man who has just understood that the woman he failed to protect is now being hunted by people with the kind of resources that don't lose hunts, and that the clock on finding her before they do has already. Marcus drove north through the night without stopping. He filled the tank in cash at a station outside Portsmouth, bought a coffee he didn't want, and got back in the car before the receipt finished printing. No toll transponder. He'd pulled it from the windshield before leaving the city. No credit cards. His personal phone was in the glove compartment with the battery removed, and a different phone, a prepaid unit he'd bought 6 months ago for reasons he couldn't have articulated at the time, but that felt now like some part of him had been preparing for exactly this, sat in the cup holder with Sable's number already dialed and waiting. The highway thinned out past Portland. Trees replaced the commercial sprawl. The sky above the tree line was the particular dark of deep November. No moon, stars smothered behind cloud cover, and Marcus drove through it with the heater running and the radio off, and his mind doing what it had always done under pressure. Sorting, sequencing, identifying what he knew against what he needed to know, building the architecture of the problem in the dark behind his eyes. He knew Victoria was a planted identity. He knew the council was aware of the pregnancy. He knew the fabricated documentation had been delivered within hours of Damon pushing back on Victoria's story, which meant someone had been monitoring that conversation, which meant the penthouse had surveillance that Damon's own security team hadn't found, which meant the breach was older and deeper than the elevator logs suggested. He knew Evelyn Carter was somewhere on the Maine coast, and that the people who needed her gone before her children were born had not yet confirmed her location. That last part was the only piece of good news, and it was thin. He crossed into Maine at 4:17 in the morning and pulled off at a rest stop outside Kennebunk to look at the property inquiry Sable had traced through Evelyn's email account, the one she'd sent from her laptop the night she left to a property management office in a coastal town called Ardmore. Sable had pulled it from a server backup that took her most of the night to access and had sent it to the prepaid phone in a message that said simply, "Ardmore, Inlet Road, property managed by D. Fitch." Marcus looked at the map. 40 minutes north. He pulled back onto the highway. He arrived in Ardmore at 5:03 a.m. and drove down Inlet Road once without stopping, just to see it. A quiet street. Houses set back from the road, most dark. The kind of neighborhood where people went to bed early and didn't ask about the cars they didn't recognize. The cottage was the fourth on the left. Small, wood-sided, a light on in what he guessed was the kitchen. He sat at the end of the road for a moment. A light on at 5 in the morning meant she wasn't sleeping well, which meant she was scared or sick or both, and either way it was not information he could do anything about from the end of a road in a car she'd never seen. He drove to the only diner in town that opened before 6, ordered coffee and eggs he didn't eat, and waited until 7:15 before driving back to Inlet Road and parking in front of the cottage. He knocked twice. Silence for 20 seconds. Then the sound of movement inside. Careful, quiet movement. The kind of movement a person makes when they're not sure who's at the door and they're not yet ready to find out. "Who is it?" Her voice through the door, steadier than he expected. "Marcus Reye," he said. "I work for Damon. I'm alone. I'm not here to bring you back." A longer silence. "How did you find me?" "Carefully," he said, "and I'm the only one who has. For now." The lock turned. The door opened 4 inches, chain still on, and one of her eyes appeared in the gap. Dark, exhausted, assessing him with the particular focus of a woman who has spent the last several days recalibrating her understanding of who she can trust. "Show me your hands," she said. He held them up, palms out. She looked at them, looked at his face, closed the door, slid the chain off, and opened it. She looked worse than he'd expected and better than she had any right to. She was in a heavy sweater and wool socks, and her hair was pulled back and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke to several nights of inadequate sleep. But her posture was straight and her jaw was set, and when she looked at him across the small kitchen, she looked like someone who had already made her peace with being afraid and was operating through it rather than around it. "Sit down," she said. Not an invitation, a decision. He sat. She remained standing, arms crossed, one hand resting instinctively just below her rib cage. He noticed it and didn't comment. "Tell me why you're here," she said. He told her. All of it, in the same way he'd told Damon. Sequenced, factual, stripped of editorializing. The planted identity, the deleted elevator logs, the fabricated documentation, the council's knowledge of the pregnancy. She didn't interrupt. She stood and listened, and her face went through several things in sequence. Recognition, then a cold settling, then something that might have been grief, except that it sat differently in the body than grief usually does. More like the feeling of a person who has just confirmed a fear they'd been holding at arm's length for a long time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They knew I was pregnant before I left." It wasn't a question. "We believe so," Marcus said, "which means the whole thing. Victoria, the setup, the timing." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "This wasn't about my marriage." "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't." She unfolded her arms and pressed both hands flat on the kitchen counter and looked at the window above the sink. The pines were gray in the early morning light. Her knuckles went white against the countertop. "They want my children," she said. "They want them not to exist," Marcus said, because she was not a woman who needed the truth softened, and softening it would only cost them time they didn't have. She absorbed that. Then she turned and looked at him with an expression he would remember for a long time. Not fear, not fury, but something that had been forged out of both of those things and had come out the other side as something harder and more durable than either. "How long do we have?" she said. "Before they confirm your location?" "I don't know. Days, maybe. Less if someone in the property management chain talks." She nodded once, went to the small table beside the window and picked up a notebook that was already half full. He could see the handwriting from across the room, dense and small, the handwriting of someone who thinks better on paper. She'd been working, planning, preparing for contingencies in the days since she arrived, not waiting to be rescued. Something shifted in his assessment of the situation. "I'm not going back," she said. "I'm not asking you to. And I'm not negotiating with Damen. Not right now, not until—" She stopped herself. Recalibrated. "What does he know about where I am?" Marcus looked at her steadily. "I told him I'd find you. He told me not to tell you he sent me." A small silence. "Why?" she said. "He said you wouldn't come back for him." A pause. "He said to make sure you were safe. That's the exact boundary he gave me." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face and was gone before he could read it. "He's right," she said quietly. "I won't. I know. But I need his resources. Thus—" She said it plainly, without apology, the way a person states an operational fact. "If what you're describing is accurate, if the council has the reach you're saying, I can't protect my children alone from inside a rented cottage in Maine. I need access to infrastructure, legal, financial, security." "I can arrange that without you going back," Marcus said. "Then that's what we do." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him and opened the notebook to a fresh page and picked up a pen. And Marcus looked at this woman, 31 years old, alone, pregnant with twins, with the full weight of a powerful criminal organization turned in her direction, and thought that in 11 years of working for the most feared man he'd ever known, he had never once sat across from anyone who scared him the way Evelyn Carter's composure scared him right now. because it meant she understood exactly how bad this was. And she was still making a list. Damon made the call to Victoria at 9 in the morning. He had not slept, had sat in the office for the hours between Marcus's departure and dawn, and then kept sitting because there was nothing else to do that didn't risk tipping his hand. And tipping his hand was the one thing he couldn't afford. Victoria answered on the third ring. "I've been thinking about what you said," Damon told her. His voice was controlled, flat in a way that he'd learned to use as a disguise. Not warmth, but the absence of temperature, which most people read as calm. "About the documentation, the financial records." "I know it's a lot to process," Victoria said carefully. "I want to meet, tonight, my office." A beat. "Of course, whatever you need." He hung up. He set the phone on the desk and pressed his fingers against his eyes and breathed through the particular nausea of pretending to believe a lie while knowing the full shape of it. He had done this before in professional contexts, had sat across from men who were stealing from him and smiled and poured them coffee, but he had never done it about Evelyn, had never had to weaponize the stillness he'd spent years building and pointed at something this close to the center of whatever he actually was. He called Cressida Vaughn into his office at 10. She came in with a tablet and a composed expression, 43 years old, brown hair in a low knot, the manner of someone who has been professionally invisible for so long it has become a personality. She sat across from him and crossed her legs and held the tablet on her knee. He watched her. She watched him. "The quarterly compliance audit," he said. "I want an update." She gave him one. 14 minutes of precise financial language. Nothing in her face, nothing in her hands, nothing anywhere that indicated she had made an 11-minute phone call to Victoria Hale 24 hours ago. She was good. He waited until she was almost done. Then he said, conversationally, almost carelessly, "Who did you speak to after I called Victoria yesterday morning?" Her hand stilled on the tablet. 1 full second. 2. "I'm sorry," she said. 11 minutes, Damon said, between 10:43 and 10:54. Who was on the other end? She looked at him. He watched her running options behind her eyes. Denial, misdirection, technical deflection. And watched her discard each one as she read his face and understood that he already knew the answer and was asking to see what she did with the question. She uncrossed her legs, set the tablet on his desk. "I want a lawyer," she said. "You're not under arrest," Damon said. "You can leave any time you want." He paused. "But you'll leave knowing that I'm going to find out everything regardless of whether you help me. The only thing you're deciding right now is which side of that outcome you're on when it's finished." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know about the pregnancy." The room went very still. "When they approached me," she said, her voice dropping in a way that was not performance, "it was a woman who had just stepped off a ledge and knew there was no climbing back up. They said it was about the inheritance clause, the charter provision. They said your wife was a security risk to the organization's structure and that removing her from the equation before it became a legal complication was—" She stopped. "I didn't know she was pregnant." Damon said nothing. "I didn't know," she said again. Lower. Like saying it twice might change what it meant. "But you know now," Damon said. She looked at the desk. He stood up. "Get out of my building," he said. "Take nothing from your desk. Your access is revoked as of this moment. If I find out you've made contact with any of them in the next 72 hours, the fact that you didn't know about the pregnancy becomes irrelevant." He held the door open. "Go." She went. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk to the elevator, and he kept his face completely still, and when the elevator doors closed, he went back to his desk and sat down and picked up his phone and called Marcus. "She was recruited," he said when Marcus answered. "She didn't know about the pregnancy, or at least she wants me to believe she didn't. Either way, she's out." "What's your status?" "Sitting in a cottage in Maine," Marcus said, "across from the most composed person I've ever met." Something moved in Damon's chest. "She's all right?" "She's better than all right," Marcus said. "She's building a plan." A pause. She wants resources, not rescue. Can you work with that? He closed his eyes for 1 second. Yes, he said. Whatever she needs. There's something else. Marcus's voice shifted. Flatter, more careful. Sable called 20 minutes ago. She found the funding source for Victoria's identity construction. Damon waited. It goes back 18 years, Marcus said. The identity was built 18 years ago, Damon. Victoria Hale, whoever she actually is, was placed inside a constructed life almost 2 decades before you ever met her. This wasn't reactive. They didn't build this because your marriage became inconvenient. A pause that had weight in it. They built this before you were who you are, before the organization was what it is. Whoever planned this was planning for you specifically, for where you were going to be. The silence on the line was absolute. Someone on that council, Marcus said, has been engineering your life for 18 years. Damon sat very still. He thought about the angles of his own history, the partnerships that had come together at the right moment, the rivals who had collapsed at convenient times, the deals that had required exactly the connections he happened to have. He thought about the shape of his own rise, which he had always attributed to intelligence and ruthlessness, and the willingness to move when other men hesitated. He thought about how it looked now, from the outside, like a path someone had built for him to walk down. Which one? He said. The words came out almost inaudible. I'm still pulling threads, Marcus said, but the funding traces through 3 shell entities back to a family trust, established in 1987. A pause. The Adler Family Trust. Constance Adler. 73 years old. Gray hair cut close. The most dangerous person in any room she'd ever been in. The woman who had sat at the council table 3 days ago and spoken for 11 minutes about inheritance clauses and structural threats, and who had done so with the particular calm of someone who already knew how the story ended because she had written the first chapter of it before Damen Volkov was 20 years old. She built you, Marcus said quietly, and now she's trying to erase the one thing she can't control about what she built. Damon stood at the window of his office, 43 stories above the city he had spent his adult life believing he had conquered, and understood for the first time that he had never been the architect of any of it. He had been the project, and the project had produced an outcome, 2 small heartbeats in a cottage in Maine, that the actual architect had not budgeted for. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Below him, the city moved without knowing any of this. Traffic, people, the ordinary machinery of a world that had no idea what was being decided in the rooms above it. Marcus, he said. Yeah. She can't stay in Ardmore. I know, I'm already working on it. There's a property, Damon said. Off book. Nothing connected to the organization. Nothing connected to my name. It's held under a trust that predates everything. I bought it 10 years ago and never used it. He paused. It's in Vermont. Mountains. No road access in winter except one. I'll send you the coordinates through the secondary line. Does anyone else know it exists? No one, Damon said. Not even you, until now. A pause. She's going to push back, Marcus said. I know. Another pause. Tell her it's not about me. Tell her it's about the children. She'll make the right call. He was right about that. Marcus looked across the small kitchen table at Evelyn Carter, who had been listening to half a conversation with her eyes fixed on the middle distance and her pen still in her hand, and when he lowered the phone and told her what Damon had said, all of it, the 18 years, the Adler Trust, the Vermont property, she didn't react for a long moment. Then she looked down at the notebook, then at her hands, then at Marcus. How long before they find this address? She said. Best case? 48 hours. Worst case, someone in that property management office makes a call they shouldn't make, and we have less than that. She nodded. She closed the notebook. She stood up and went to the window and looked at the pines for what Marcus understood was the last time. The way a person looks at a place they know they're leaving, taking a quick inventory of what they're losing before they accept that they have to lose it. Okay, she said, with her back to him, her hand pressed flat below her ribs. She turned around. Her face had changed. Not hardened exactly, more like she had found the floor beneath the fear and planted her feet on it and decided that was where she was going to stand from now on, regardless of what came at her. When do we leave? She said. Marcus looked at her. Now, he said. She picked up the notebook and walked to the bedroom to pack, and Marcus stood in the small kitchen of the cold Maine cottage and called the prepaid number and spoke 4 words to the person who answered on the other end. A woman whose name he didn't know, who moved people in situations like this one, who had been on his emergency contact list for 6 years, and whom he had never needed until tonight. 4 words. The woman on the other end said, "Give me 2 hours." Outside, the wind came off the water and moved through the pines in long, slow waves, and somewhere in the city to the south, Constance Adler picked up her phone and read a message that told her the property inquiry in Ardmore had been traced, and she set the phone face down on the table and called the man who handled logistics and said, with the patience of someone who has been waiting 18 years for a particular problem to resolve itself, "Find her." And the clock, which had been running since the moment Evelyn walked out of that building, dropped below 48 hours without anyone in the cottage on Inlet Road knowing it had already done so. Marcus came out of the kitchen when he heard Evelyn's footsteps stop in the bedroom doorway. She was standing with a packed bag over one shoulder and the notebook tucked under her arm, and she was looking at him with an expression that told him she had just thought of something she needed to say before they walked out of this cottage and the situation became purely operational. "The person who's coming to move us," she said. "Does she know who I am?" "She knows you need to be moved safely," Marcus said. "Nothing else." "Keep it that way." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "And Marcus," she held his gaze, "when this is over, when my children are safe and whatever Damon is planning with the council is finished, I need you to understand something." He waited. "I'm not a piece of this," she said. "I'm not an asset to be relocated and protected and managed. I'm a person who got pulled into something I didn't design, and I'm making survival decisions right now, not loyalty decisions. You understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She moved toward the door. "Then let's go." He took the bag from her shoulder without asking and carried it to the car, because she was 14 weeks pregnant, and the bag was heavy, and some things didn't require negotiation. She let him take it without comment, which told him everything he needed to know about her current state. She was conserving, choosing every expenditure of energy with precision, not fighting the small things because the large things were going to require everything she had. He held the car door. She got in. He started the engine and pulled out of Inlet Road for the last time, and neither of them looked back at the cottage, because looking back was a thing you did when you had the luxury of sentiment, and sentiment was something both of them had quietly agreed to defer until there was a safer place to feel it. Evelyn opened the notebook on her knee as they drove. She began writing in the small, dense handwriting he'd seen earlier, and he didn't ask what she was writing because it wasn't his business. But at a stop sign outside town, he caught a glimpse of the page. Names, dates, questions. She was building her own case file. He put the car back in drive and headed for the highway, and the town of Ardmore disappeared behind them in the rear view, and 40 minutes later, a car with 2 of Constance Adler's people in it turned onto Inlet Road and stopped in front of a dark cottage that smelled like pine and old coffee and the particular emptiness of a place someone left in a hurry. They were already gone. But the margin between safe and found had just collapsed to nothing, and everyone involved knew it, and the next move belonged to a 73-year-old woman who had been waiting 18 years to make it. The Vermont property was a farmhouse built into the side of a mountain that didn't appear on any real estate registry, accessed by a single unpaved road that became impassable after the first serious snowfall of the season, which had happened 4 days ago. Marcus got them there in 6 hours, switching vehicles twice. Once in Augusta, once in a town outside Montpelier, whose name Evelyn didn't catch because she had fallen asleep somewhere in New Hampshire and woken up to mountains. The second vehicle was a truck with snow chains already on, waiting in the parking lot of a hardware store with the keys above the visor, arranged by the woman Marcus had called with 4 words, who Evelyn had decided not to ask about because there were things that were useful to know and things that were useful to not know, and that woman was firmly in the second category. The farmhouse was cold when they arrived. Stone foundation, heavy timber framing, the kind of construction that predated insulation as a concept but made up for it in sheer mass. Marcus went in first, moved through every room before he let her cross the threshold, which she found simultaneously patronizing and reasonable, and said nothing about either. There was a wood stove in the main room, firewood stacked along the entire length of the back wall, a kitchen with canned goods and a hand pump water filter and a propane range, a bedroom with a bed that had been made up by someone at some point, the sheets gone slightly stiff with cold. Evelyn stood in the middle of the main room with her coat still on and looked at all of it. "How long has he owned this?" she said. 10 years, Marcus said, crouching in front of the wood stove with newspaper and a match. "He never told me." "No." She looked at the walls, the stone, the windows with their deep sills, the glass old enough to have a slight waviness to it, the kind that distorted the tree line into something impressionist. She thought about a man who built empires and kept a stone farmhouse on a mountain that no one knew about, and she couldn't decide if it made him more complicated or more legible. Both, probably. It was usually both. Dullman had Victoria in his office at 9 that evening. He'd spent the day preparing. Not emotionally, he had no room for emotion right now. It was a resource he couldn't afford, but operationally. He had people in position. He had the forensic evidence Marcus had compiled, printed, and organized in a manila folder that sat on the corner of his desk with the unassuming presence of something that was about to end several careers and at least one carefully constructed life. He had a recording device active, small enough to be invisible, because he needed her words on record for the legal mechanisms he was going to trigger the moment this conversation was finished. He had a glass of water on the desk for her. He had nothing for himself. She came in wearing a dark coat over a gray dress, the particular put-togetherness of a woman who treats appearance as armor, and she sat across from him and crossed her ankles and looked at him with an expression of careful, calibrated sympathy that he now read as fluently as a language he'd spent years studying without knowing he was doing it. "How are you holding up?" she said. "Close the door," he said. She did. Came back to the chair, sat. He opened the manila folder and turned it to face her and pushed it across the desk. She looked down at it. He watched her face. The first thing that moved across it was recognition. Not surprise, recognition, which was the tell he'd been waiting for. Surprise makes a person's face go briefly blank. Recognition makes it go briefly still, which is different, which is the face of someone encountering something they've already modeled and are now calculating the gap between the model and reality. She looked at the folder for 4 seconds. Then she looked up. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Does it matter?" "Damon, your real name," he said. "Let's start there. Because Victoria Hale died at 19 months old in 1987, and whatever your name actually is, it's not hers." The room went completely quiet. Outside, 43 floors below, the city continued its indifferent machinery. In here, a woman who had spent 2 decades building a life on a dead child's identity sat across a desk from the man that life had been built to manage, and made a decision he could see her making in real time. The decision about how much truth to spend. "My name is Anna Voss," she said. He hadn't expected that, the directness of it. He kept his face still. "I was 21 when they approached me," she said. "Constance's people. I was in a situation. I needed a way out of it, and they offered one, and I was 21 years old, and I took it." She held his gaze without flinching, which he grudgingly noted. "The identity was already built. They had it ready. All I had to do was become her. And insert yourself into my life. Eventually. Yes." A pause. "It took years. They were patient." "What were you told to do?" "Watch," she said. "Report. And when the time came, when you became serious about someone, manage the relationship." "Manage," he repeated. "Make sure it didn't produce heirs." She said it flatly, with the flatness of a person who has decided that if she's falling, she's going to fall all the way rather than grab for things on the way down. Constance had been planning for the inheritance clause for a long time. She needed you functional, productive, profitable. She didn't need you to have biological children who would one day inherit control of assets she'd spent decades positioning herself around. Damon looked at her. "I didn't know Evelyn was pregnant," she said. "I want you to understand that." "You said that already." "Because it's true." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. The first crack, the first thing in the conversation that felt unmanaged. I was told to end the marriage. I was not told there were children involved. But you did it anyway, he said. The night, the conversation you made sure she'd overhear, the access to my building, the fabricated documentation. Yes, you destroyed my marriage to protect an old woman's financial position. I destroyed your marriage, she said, because I was 21 years old when they got their hooks into me, and I have spent 22 years being someone who doesn't exist. And the only way out of that was through, and I was tired. Her voice had dropped, gone rough. I was so tired, Damon. You don't know what it is to be a fiction for 20 years. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, You're going to give me everything, every contact, every communication, the full chain between you and Constance. You're going to give it to me tonight, in this room, in enough detail that my lawyers can build a case that takes the council apart before the end of the month. She looked at the folder. And if I do, she said, I can't protect you from all of it, he said, but I can make sure the people who recruited a 21-year-old and handed her a dead child's identity are standing in front of a judge before you are. A long silence. She'll know, Victoria, Anna said quietly. The moment I start talking. She has people everywhere, Damon. Inside your organization, inside the legal system. She's been building this for 18 years and she doesn't lose. She's going to lose tonight, Damon said. He believed it when he said it. He was wrong about the timeline, and the wrongness of it was going to cost him more than he had left to spend. So, the call came to Marcus's prepaid phone at 11:47 p.m. He was in the farmhouse kitchen, sitting across from Evelyn, who had been awake for the last 2 hours running through the legal structure of the inheritance clause on paper. She'd called her lawyer from the farmhouse landline, an old rotary unit that couldn't be traced to anything modern, and had spent 40 minutes on the phone before coming back to the kitchen table with 3 pages of notes and the expression of someone who has just found a structural weakness in the thing that's trying to kill them. He looked at the prepaid screen. Unknown number. But the prefix, a particular sequence he'd set up as a signal years ago with a specific contact, told him who it was before he answered. He answered. He listened for 90 seconds without speaking. Then he said, How many? The voice on the other end said, 4 vehicles, maybe 20 minutes out. Someone talked, Marcus. Someone in the chain between the property manager and the rental agreement. He was already standing. Which road? The only road. He hung up. Evelyn looked at him from across the table. She read his face in about 1 second and said, How long? 20 minutes. Maybe less. She stood up. No hesitation, no visible fear, or rather fear converted so quickly into action that it skipped the visible stage entirely. What do we have? In terms of defense, this building, the wood stove, and whatever's in the truck. He was already moving toward the back of the house. There's a cellar, stone walls, single entrance. The door is 3 inches of solid wood. I'm not going in a cellar, she said. He turned and looked at her. I'm 20 weeks pregnant, she said, not incapacitated. Tell me what needs to be done. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he said, The truck. Can you drive it with the chains on? Yes. There's a fire road behind the property. It runs northeast for about 4 miles before it connects to a state route. It's rough and it's dark, and with chains you're looking at 30 miles an hour maximum. He held her gaze. You take the truck. You take the notebook. You get to the state route and you drive south until you have cell signal and you call this number. He wrote it on the corner of a page she tore from the notebook. It's a lawyer. She's already been briefed. She knows who you are and she knows what to do. Evelyn looked at the number. What about you? She said. I'm going to make sure they spend enough time on the front of this property that you have time to clear the back. She looked at him. Marcus, go, he said. Please. She took the paper, folded it once, and put it in her coat pocket. Picked up the notebook. Looked at him one more time with an expression that had too many things in it to name quickly, and then she went out the back door into the cold Vermont dark, and he heard the truck door open and close and the engine turn over. He went to the front window, headlights on the road below. 3 sets. Moving slowly, which meant they were being careful, which meant they were professionals, which meant this was not going to be simple. He picked up the wood stove poker from beside the hearth, which was the only thing in the farmhouse that approximated a weapon, and thought about the gap between what he had and what was coming up that road, and permitted himself exactly 1 second of honest acknowledgement that this was bad. Then he went to work. He killed every light in the house, moved to the side window, away from the direct sight line of the road, and watched the vehicles slow at the base of the property. They had cut their headlights. He could see them only as shapes now, dark against the slightly lighter dark of the snow, and he counted. 3 vehicles, multiple figures, organized movement, the kind of organization that came from people who did this regularly and had protocols for it. He heard the truck engine fading to the northeast. She was moving. He needed 4 minutes, maybe 5. He moved to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch with the poker in his hand and his heart running at about twice its normal rate, and called out into the dark, "Whoever's in charge down there, come talk to me." Silence for a moment. Then a voice, male, unhurried, with the particular confidence of a man who is holding more cards than the person he's talking to. "Marcus Ray, step off the porch." "Not yet," Marcus said. "I want to talk to whoever gave the order to come up here. Is Constance Adler in one of those vehicles?" A pause. Then a different voice, older, female. "Hello, Marcus." He'd been right. She had come herself. He hadn't expected that. Had expected proxies, handlers, the layers of insulation that powerful people use to keep their hands clean. But she was here, which meant one of 2 things. Either she was confident enough in the outcome that she didn't feel the need for distance, or she was here because she wanted to make sure something specific happened in a specific way and didn't trust anyone else to ensure it. Both possibilities were bad. "Constance," he said, keeping his voice steady, buying seconds. "You drove 4 hours to the Vermont mountains at midnight. I've been waiting 18 years to close this particular file," she said. 4 hours is nothing. "The woman you're looking for isn't here." A pause. "I know," Constance said. "I heard the truck leave 6 minutes ago. We'll find her. The fire road connects to Route 14. I have people at the junction." A pause. "I'm not here for her tonight, Marcus. I'm here for you, because you've been building a case and I need to understand exactly how much you know before I decide what to do about it." Marcus tightened his grip on the poker. Behind him, the farmhouse was dark and cold and empty. In front of him, somewhere in the darkness at the base of the property, a 73-year-old woman who had engineered 18 years of someone else's life was waiting with the patience of someone who had never once been in a hurry because she'd always controlled the timeline. "Come inside," Marcus said. "Just you." A long silence. Then the sound of a car door, footsteps on the snow-packed path. Constance Adler came up the porch steps alone, which was either a sign of supreme confidence or a test of his, and stepped into the dark farmhouse, and Marcus stepped back to let her pass, and the door closed behind them both, and outside the 3 vehicles sat silent and waiting, and 4 miles to the northeast on a dark fire road. A truck with snow chains ground steadily forward through the trees, and the woman inside it pressed one hand flat against her stomach and kept the other steady on the wheel and did not stop. Evelyn came out of the tree line onto the state route at 12:19 a.m., and her phone found signal at 12:21, and she pulled over on the shoulder with the engine running and the heat blasting and her hand shaking for the first time since she'd left the cottage in Maine. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the specific physical exhaustion of a body that has been running on adrenaline and will for 6 hours and has just been told by the state route and the cell signal and the lawyer's number in her coat pocket that it is allowed, briefly, to acknowledge what it has been through. She sat there for 30 seconds, then she dialed. The lawyer answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant Marcus had prepared this better than she'd understood, and Evelyn said, "This is Evelyn Carter. I need you to file the inheritance declaration tonight. Both children, full legal documentation, everything Marcus briefed you on." "It's after midnight," the lawyer said. "I know what time it is," Evelyn said. "File it. Emergency motion, protective injunction, the works. I need it on record before dawn." A pause. "All right," the lawyer said. "Where are you?" Evelyn looked at the road sign. She read it off. There's a motel 2 miles south, the lawyer said. Check in under the name we discussed. I'll have a courier there by 6 a.m. Thank you. She hung up. She sat on the shoulder of Route 14 with the snow coming down soft and steady outside the windows, coating the truck in a thin white layer that softened every edge. And she thought about Marcus in that farmhouse with Constance Adler. And she thought about Damon in his office 43 stories above a city that didn't know any of this was happening. And she thought about two heartbeats, still strong, still stubborn, still completely unaware of the machinery that had been arranged against them before they existed. She put the truck in drive. 2 miles south, the motel sign came out of the snow like a dim orange promise, and she pulled in and paid cash at the desk and went to the room and sat on the edge of the bed without taking her coat off and picked up the room phone and dialed a number she had not dialed in 3 weeks. It rang twice. He answered immediately. She knew he would. Evelyn? His voice. Raw in a way she had never once heard it before, stripped of every layer, just the sound of a man who has been waiting for something and has just had it arrive and doesn't know yet what it costs. She pressed her lips together. I'm safe, she said. The children are safe. A silence on the line that was not empty, that was full of everything neither of them could say yet. All the distance and damage and the terrible specific grief of two people who had failed each other in different ways and were still, somehow, on the phone together at 12:30 in the morning. Marcus is with Constance, she said. I don't know what's happening there. I'll find out, he said. Immediate. Operational. The part of him that knew how to handle crisis, which was every part of him, but underneath it, she could hear the other thing. The thing that had no tactical application. Are you hurt? No. Are they? They're fine, she said. They're strong. Another silence. Damon. She said his name carefully, like something she was picking up after a long time in a place she'd left it. Whatever happens next, with the council, with the legal filings, with all of it, I need you to understand something. Tell me, he said. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing this for them. You understand? Yes, he said. But she stopped, started again. But when it's over, when they're safe and this is finished and there's nothing left to survive, I need you to be there. Not the organization, not the infrastructure, you. A pause. Can you do that? The silence this time was the longest. Yes, he said, and then quieter. Evelyn, I'm sorry. She closed her eyes. I know, she said. She set the phone back in the cradle without saying goodbye, because goodbye was a door and she wasn't ready to open any more doors tonight. And she lay back on the bed with her coat still on and her hand flat on her stomach and listened to the snow come down outside the window, soft and indifferent, and covering everything. And in the farmhouse on the mountain 4 miles north, Marcus Reyes sat across from Constance Adler in the dark and looked at the woman who had built 18 years of someone else's life and said, I want you to hear something, and pressed play on the recording he'd made of Anna Voss in Damon's office, and watched Constance Adler's face in the dim light of the wood stove as she heard her own operation described in precise detail by the woman she'd trusted to run it, and watched the confidence go out of her face like a light being switched off in an empty room. She was still for a long moment after the recording ended. The wood stove ticked, snow pressed against the windows. Outside, her people waited with the patience of professionals who were paid not to ask questions. Then Constance said, That's inadmissible. In a criminal court, maybe, Marcus said, in front of the council's own oversight committee, the one you've been suppressing for 6 years, it's enough to open an investigation, and an investigation is all I need. He leaned forward. Because once it opens, the shell entities come apart. The Adler family trust comes apart. 18 years of documented manipulation of a council partner comes apart. And you know what's left when all of that comes apart, Constance? She looked at him. Nothing, he said. You're left with nothing. She sat with that. He watched her absorb it, watched the calculation run behind her eyes. The same calculation she'd been running for 18 years, angles and leverage and the geometry of power. watched her look for the move that got her out of this and find, for the first time, that the board had been rearranged while she was focused on a different game. "The inheritance filing," she said quietly. "It's already been submitted." "About 40 minutes ago," Marcus said. "Both children, full legal standing, protective injunction. It's on record." She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, something had changed in them. Not defeat exactly, but the particular stillness of a person who has just watched the last viable option leave the table. "What do you want?" she said. "A confession," Marcus said. "Everything. Recorded. The identity construction, the council coordination, the instructions given to Anna Voss, the plan for Evelyn and the children. All of it tonight, in this room. And in exchange, you walk out of this house under your own power," he said. "What happens after that is between you and the lawyers." A long silence. The wood stove popped once, loud in the quiet. Constance Adler looked at Marcus Ray across the dark room and understood, with the clarity that comes to people who have spent their lives being the most dangerous person present and have just encountered the limits of that particular identity, that she had spent 18 years building something that a man with a legal pad and a prepaid phone had taken apart in 72 hours. Not because he was smarter than her, because he had been paying attention to the right things. She straightened in her chair. "Start the recording," she said. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pressed the button on the second device, the one he hadn't told her about, the one that had been running since she walked through the door, and said nothing, because she was already talking, and the snow kept falling outside, and 4 miles south on Route 14 in a motel room with orange light seeping under the door, Evelyn Carter finally closed her eyes and slept. The confession ran for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Marcus sat across from Constance Adler in the dark farmhouse and let her talk, only interrupting when she used language that obscured rather than clarified, when she reached for the comfortable abstractions that powerful people use to describe the harm they've done in terms that keep it at a safe distance. When she said manage the situation, he said, "You mean you arranged for a pregnant woman to be driven from her home?" When she said structural necessities, he said, "You mean the council voted to erase 2 children before they were born?" He made her use the plain words each time, because the plain words were what the recording needed, and because he was, underneath his professional stillness, genuinely furious in a way he had not allowed himself to feel until now. She used the plain words. All of them. By the end, she looked older than she had when she walked in. Not physically diminished, Constance Adler was not a woman who diminished easily, but emptied out in some fundamental way, like a building that is still structurally intact but has had everything that made it habitable removed. She sat with her hands folded on her knees and her spine straight, and her face composed into something that was not quite dignity, but was the closest thing to it that remained available to her. When she finished, Marcus stopped the recording. He looked at her. "The people outside," he said. "Tell them to go home." She took out her phone and made a call that lasted 12 seconds. Outside, he heard engines turn over, the crunch of tires on snow. The headlights swept across the farmhouse windows and then diminished and then were gone, and the mountain went quiet around them in the particular way that mountains go quiet in winter, which is completely and without apology. "The Oversight Committee," Marcus said. "You said you've been suppressing it for 6 years." "Yes." "Who chairs it?" She gave him a name. He wrote it on the back of his hand because he'd left the legal pad in the car. "Call them tomorrow morning," he said. "Before your lawyers, before anyone else. You call the chair of the Oversight Committee and you tell them you're prepared to cooperate fully." She looked at him. "You understand what that means for me?" "Yes," he said. "Do you understand what you did to an innocent woman and 2 children who weren't born yet?" A silence. "Call the chair," he said. "First thing tomorrow." She stood, picked up her coat from the back of the chair, buttoned it slowly, each button deliberate. The movements of a woman performing a kind of dignity she no longer had full claim to, but was going to perform anyway because it was all she had left. At the door, she stopped. "The children," she said, without turning around. "They'll be all right?" Marcus looked at her back. "That was never your question to ask," he said. She opened the door and walked out into the snow, and he listened to her footsteps until they were gone. Then he sat alone in the dark farmhouse for a long time, in the warmth of the wood stove, and let his hands stop shaking before he picked up the prepaid phone and made the calls that needed to be made. The courier arrived at the motel at 5:50 a.m., 10 minutes early, a young woman with close-cropped hair and a waterproof envelope who handed it to Evelyn at the door without ceremony and left without being asked any questions. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. The inheritance declaration, filed at 1:17 a.m., time-stamped and court-registered, both children named as legal heirs to the Volkov family charter holdings with full protective status under 3 separate legal mechanisms that her lawyer had assembled in the space of 4 hours, which told Evelyn something about how long the lawyer had been preparing for this call, even before it came. She read every page. James and Clara Volkov, named before they were born, before she had decided on those names, before anything was settled or safe or even survivable. She had given them their names on paper in the middle of the night in a motel room in Vermont while snow came down outside. And something about the plainness of it, the complete lack of ceremony, the fluorescent bathroom light and the scratchy motel bedspread and the legal language that was the opposite of beautiful, made it feel more real than anything else that had happened in the last 3 weeks. She set the papers down. She pressed both hands flat on her stomach. "James?" she said quietly to the room. "Clara." The first time she'd said the names out loud. She sat with that for a while. Damon drove to Vermont himself. Marcus had called him at 4 a.m. with the full account. The confession, the recording, the vehicles that had come up the mountain and left again, Evelyn's location at the motel on Route 14. He had listened to all of it without speaking, and when Marcus finished, he said, "Is she all right?" And Marcus said, "She's better than all right. She's been that way this whole time. You should know that going in." And Damon said, "I know it," because he did know it, had always known it, which was one of the many specific failures he was going to have to live with. He drove the 4 hours alone. No security, no second vehicle. He had people handling the legal activation of the confession recording. His lawyers had been awake since 2 a.m. The oversight committee chair had received an encrypted file by 3, and by the time Damon crossed into Vermont, the machinery of Constance Adler's unraveling was already running without him, which was fine, which was correct. He had spent enough of his life being the center of the machinery. He pulled into the motel lot at 8:43 in the morning. He sat in the car. He looked at the row of doors, plain wood, each with a number. The motel, the kind of place that existed purely as a functional object with no pretension toward anything else, and found the number Marcus had given him and sat looking at it. He had prepared nothing to say. He had learned in the last 72 hours that preparation was not the resource the situation required. He got out of the car. He knocked. The door opened after a moment, and Evelyn stood in the frame, in the same coat she'd been wearing when she left Ardmore, her hair down, the legal papers visible on the bed behind her, and she looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he did not try to simplify. He looked at her. He looked at the visible change in her, the way 20 weeks of pregnancy had altered the architecture of her, something he had not been present for and could not reclaim, and the specific grief of that, the precise shape of what his absence had cost him, hit him somewhere below the sternum and stayed there. "You drove yourself," she said. "Yes." "No security?" "No." She looked past him at the empty lot, the single car, the snow-covered highway beyond. Then she stepped back from the door. He came inside. They sat at the small table by the window, 2 chairs, a lamp, the kind of furniture that motel rooms provide as an acknowledgement that people sometimes need to sit across from each other. Outside, the snow had stopped. The morning was gray and very still. A plow went by on the highway, its yellow light blinking slow and indifferent. He told her everything. Not a summary, not the version edited for operational efficiency. Everything, in order, beginning with the morning she left and ending with Constance Adler's footsteps in the snow. He told her about the envelope on his desk and what he'd done with the fabricated documents, what he'd believed and how long he'd believed it, the specific mechanism by which a man who prided himself on reading situations clearly had read the most important one entirely wrong. He did not excuse any of it. She listened with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, not drinking it, just holding it, and her face moved through things he watched but didn't try to interpret because they weren't his to interpret. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Anna Voss, she said finally, not Victoria, the real name. Did she know they were going to send people to the farmhouse? I don't think so, Damon said. She gave us Constance because she wanted out. She didn't know the operational details. Where is she now? Cooperating with the Oversight Committee. She's been doing it since 6 this morning. Her lawyer negotiated a framework. A pause. She asked me to tell you she was sorry. I'm passing it on. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. Evelyn looked at the window. 7 years, she said. 7 years I thought she was my friend. He said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The worst part, Evelyn said, is that some of it was real. That's what I keep coming back to. There were moments that were real, and I can't separate them from the rest. I can't go back through 7 years and identify which parts were her and which parts were the assignment, and I never will be able to. She looked at the cold coffee. That's the part they don't give back to you. He looked at her hands on the cup. I know. No, she said, not unkindly. You don't. But you can understand it, which is different, and right now that's enough. A silence between them that was not hostile. That was the silence of two people sitting in the aftermath of something large, letting their nervous systems register the fact that the immediate emergency is over before they attempt anything more complex. Damon, she said. He looked up. The children's names, she said. I chose them. I need you to know that I chose them without asking you because I was in a motel room at 1 a.m. filling out legal documents and I needed to put names on paper and She stopped. They're James and Clara. If you have... They're perfect, he said. She looked at him. James and Clara, he said again, and something happened in his face when he said the names. Some movement she hadn't seen in 3 years of marriage. Something that bypassed every layer of control and arrived on his face before he could decide what to do with it. She looked away, gave him a moment with it. He didn't waste the moment. The legal proceedings against the Adler Council faction took 11 weeks. Constance's confession, combined with Anna Voss's full cooperation and the forensic reconstruction of 18 years of documented manipulation, produced a case that the Oversight Committee described, in its formal findings, as the most systematic abuse of council authority in the organization's history. 4 members were removed. 3 faced criminal referrals through channels that operated parallel to the conventional legal system, and were, in their way, considerably less forgiving. 2 resigned before the investigation reached them, which helped them very little. Constance Adler was 73 years old and had enough lawyers to delay nearly everything indefinitely. But her authority within the council was gone in the first week, stripped by a unanimous vote that Damon did not attend because he had other things to do that day, things that mattered more than watching a woman lose the power she'd spent her life accumulating. He heard about the vote by text. He read the text and put the phone in his pocket and went back to what he was doing, which was assembling flat-pack furniture in a nursery in a house in a small coastal town south of Portland that Evelyn had chosen because it had a school she liked within walking distance and a harbor she could see from the kitchen window. He had not suggested the town. She had found it herself. He had asked if he could come. She had said, "You can help with the furniture," which was, he understood, the most precise and honest answer she could have given him. And he accepted it as such and drove up the following weekend with tools he'd actually bought himself at a hardware store, which was the first time in his adult life he had personally purchased tools from a hardware store. And the normalcy of that small transaction had hit him somewhere undefended on the drive up. He was bad at the furniture. She found this funnier than she expected to. He found that her laughing at him was something he would have rearranged entire structures of power to produce, which was information about himself that he sat with quietly while he wrestled with the flat-pack instructions, and she sat in the doorway of the nursery with her feet up and told him he was holding the diagram upside down. He was. James and Clara Volkov were born in February, 6 weeks ahead of schedule, in a hospital 20 minutes from the coastal house, in a delivery that the attending physician later described in her notes as complicated and in which Evelyn would later describe, to the 3 people she told about it, as the most terrifying 4 hours of her life. Damon was beside her for all 4 hours. He did not leave the room, did not step out when things became difficult and frightening in the way that deliveries sometimes do. When monitors alarmed and voices sharpened and the quality of the air in the room changed in that specific way that tells everyone present that the situation has moved from difficult into something with more serious stakes. He stayed beside her and held her hand and said very little, because there was very little to say, and the little he said was her name. Once, when she looked at him with an expression that was past fear and into something more fundamental than fear, and he said her name the way you say something you are not willing to lose. She heard it. She held on to it. Clara came first, small and furious, announcing herself to the world with a sound that was disproportionate to her size. James followed 4 minutes later, quieter, which the nurses said meant nothing, but which turned out, over the following months, to be a reasonable preview of his general approach to existence. Damon held Clara first because Evelyn told him to, because the nurse placed Clara in his direction and Evelyn said, "Go ahead," in a voice that was destroyed with exhaustion and meant it entirely. He stood at the side of the room with his daughter in his arms and looked at her, really looked, with the concentrated attention he usually reserved for situations that required strategy, but this required nothing except looking, and something in him that had been structured and armored and controlled for as long as he could remember came apart quietly and without drama, the way things come apart when they're finally allowed to. He did not cry, but it was close. Evelyn watched him from the bed. She watched his face with Clara in his arms and thought about the man she'd married and the man who'd failed her and the man who'd driven to a motel in Vermont alone with nothing prepared to say, and understood that these were all the same man, which was not an excuse for any of it, but was a true thing. And true things mattered to her more than comfortable ones. She didn't say anything. She just watched. And when he brought Clara to her and stood at the bedside and looked at the two of them together, he said, "Thank you," which was not adequate and which he knew was not adequate and which he said anyway because it was the truest thing available. She looked up at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. The months after the birth moved differently than the months before. Damon stayed in the coastal town. Not in the house. Evelyn had been clear about that, had a separate apartment 3 streets over that he used as a base, which was not what he wanted and was exactly what the situation required, and he knew the difference and honored it. He was at the house every morning by 7. He learned the particular language of 2 infants, Clara's specific cry that meant hunger versus the one that meant discomfort, James's habit of going suddenly silent before he escalated, the way they both settled when held a certain way that took him 2 weeks to figure out, and felt when he finally got it right, like solving something that mattered. He woke at midnight feedings. He drove to the pharmacy at 2 in the morning when they ran out of things. He sat on the floor of the nursery at 3 a.m. with James on his chest and Clara asleep in the crib and the monitor glowing green in the corner, and thought about 18 years of a path that had been built for him and wondered how much of his life was actually his, and decided, sitting there in the dark with his son's weight against his sternum, that the answer to that question mattered less than what he did from here. He restructured the organization over the following months in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the man who'd built it, not dismantled. The legitimate holdings were real and employed real people and generated real livelihoods, and dismantling them would have been its own kind of damage, but restructured, separated from the darker architecture that had always provided its foundation, a process that was slow and complicated, and that his remaining people approached with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and that he pursued with a consistency that surprised even Marcus. Marcus visited the coastal town occasionally. He and Evelyn had developed, over the course of everything, a respect for each other that neither of them commented on because it existed in the space where words would have made it smaller. He would sit at her kitchen table and drink her coffee and update her on the proceedings, and she would listen and ask precise questions, and when he left, she would stand at the kitchen window and watch his car until it turned the corner. She was rebuilding the design firm remotely, had told her partner the minimum necessary and received, to her relief, the minimum necessary in response. Not a flood of concern and questions, but a quiet, practical conversation about transitioning client loads and adjusting timelines, which was exactly what she needed from a professional relationship and exactly what she got. Her days had a shape now. Not the shape of her old life, not the shape of the 3 weeks of survival that had preceded this. A new shape, built from smaller materials, fitted together one ordinary day at a time. One morning in October, when the twins were 8 months old and Clara had just pulled herself upright for the first time against the coffee table and stood there with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, before sitting down hard on the rug, Damon was sitting on the floor nearby and caught her on the second attempt and looked up and found Evelyn watching from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame with her arms crossed and her coffee in one hand and the morning light behind her, and she was looking at him and Clara with an expression he didn't try to name because naming it felt like something that could make it go away. He looked at her. She looked at him. Clara made a sound of renewed determination and grabbed the coffee table and pulled herself up again. "She's going to be a problem," Evelyn said. "Yeah," Damon said, watching his daughter. "She is." A pause. "You're staying for dinner?" Evelyn said. He looked up. She was still in the doorway. Her expression hadn't changed. She was asking a question that was also several other questions, layered underneath the practical one, and he understood all of them and answered the one she'd said out loud. "If you want me to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed off the doorframe and went back to the kitchen, and he heard the sound of the refrigerator, the particular percussion of someone beginning to cook a meal, and he sat on the floor between his two children and understood that this was not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but it was a door she'd left open, and for the first time in his life, Damon Volkov understood the difference between a door that was open and a door that was his to walk through. Understood that open was not the same as offered, that presence was not the same as permission, and that the only way to earn the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be was to stop calculating it and start crossing it, one dinner at a time, one morning at 7, one midnight feeding in a dark room with a sleeping child on his chest, and the monitor glowing green and the sound of the sea, faint and steady, coming through the window. James made a small sound in his sleep. Damon put his hand gently on his son's back. The house was quiet. Outside, the October light moved through the kitchen window and across the floor and touched everything it reached without asking for anything in return. And in the kitchen, Evelyn Carter stood at the stove in a coastal town she had chosen for herself and cooked a meal she had not been asked to cook. And neither of them said what was happening because what was happening was too real for language and too new for certainty and too valuable to risk with words before it had the time to become what it was trying to become. The most valuable things are not inherited. They are not bought. They cannot be taken or controlled or engineered by a woman with 18 years of patience and a family trust and the belief that human lives are positions on a board. They are built from mornings and midnight and coffee going cold on a table while two people sit across from each other in a motel room and choose, against every reason not to still be honest. They are earned. Clara pulled herself up a third time. This time, she stayed.